Okay, welcome to tonight's class, and we are working on positivity bias, and we're on the 7th chapter called Of Virtuous Villains and Sinful Saints. And I really love this chapter. It reminds me of, there's a mitzvah called Pigeon Shavuot, to redeem those who are captive. In other words, if someone's in prison, it's a mitzvah to get a Jew out of prison. And the idea of that, prisons are a very difficult place to be, period. And if we can get a Jew out of prison, we want to do so. And in this sense, there are people who've been cast in a negative light, and in a sense are captured in that. And I think it's fascinating to see how the Rebbe is able to redeem them, to literally redeem them from the past perceptions. And what it takes, we say that old saying about love is blind, right? So what does it mean love is blind? It means when you care about someone deeply, you only see the good stuff, you don't see the flaws. And that's the way of Ahavas Yisrael. Love for a fellow Jew is meant to be literally blind, to be able to care about someone so much that you see the positive things and you can't see the negative stuff. That's the intention here. And so I love the fact in this chapter that the Rebbe repeatedly finds the good, digs deep and finds the good, and in a sense redeems people from the chapters. But we've talked about that before. But what's unique here is that Rebbe is not just talking about people currently alive. He's actually redeeming people from the past, people that already have a really bad rep of one way or another, and the Rebbe finds the good and highlights the good, shines a light on that, and in a sense redeems them from that prison of being seen in a bad light. And the first example again is, and he's not doing this, with the political thing about twisting the reality and coloring the story in a different light, twisting things. It's not doing that. He's actually just going deeper into the reality. And the first example that he gives here is straight from Mishnah, from Pirkei Avos. Pirkei Avos is the ethics of our fathers. And he takes two Pirkei Avos. One, and again, if you were learning Pirkei Avos, you wouldn't necessarily go see anywhere as deep as this. But he learns, for example, in Pirkei Avos, Elisha ben Avuya, he taught that he who studies Torah as a child, to what can he be compared? To ink written on fresh paper. And he who studies Torah as an old man, to what can he be compared? To ink written on paper that has been erased. So if you look at the Mishnah by itself, if you're learning Torah when you're younger, then it's fresh ideas and it sticks and it stays. To someone's written on when they're older in life, then it's being rewritten on top of other stuff, right? It's not as solid, it's not as permanent, it's not as clear. And then there's another Mishnah from Rabbi Meir that says, look not at the vessel, but look at what it contains. The old, don't judge a book by its cover, right? Two separate Mishnayos. If you just learn them by themselves, the ethics of our fathers makes sense, right? What does the Rebbe do? The Rebbe says, hang on a second. Who said each quote, and what was their relationship? You need to know, if you really want to understand a piece of Torah, you have to know who wrote it. You have to know the author. You have to know what they were looking at. What did they mean, right? And so when we look at Elisha ben Avuya, he's not often quoted. And the reason he's not often quoted is because even though he was a great Torah scholar and he was a great Torah teacher, at some point he went off the wagon. He totally and publicly went away from the teachings of Torah and publicly desecrated Shabbos, and just so much so that the sages refused at some point to even call him by his name. They call him Acher, other, the one.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in order to strip him of because that's how bad it was. I mean, it's bad enough to to not necessarily follow Torah and mitzvahs, but to do so intentionally and do so publicly intentionally to make a statement, that is really offensive. So he was called Acher. So that's Elisha ben Avuya. Who was Rebbe Meir? Rebbe Meir was actually a student of Acher, but not when he was Acher. He was a student of his when he was called Elisha ben Avuya. He was a top student, right? And even when Elisha went off the path, Rebbe Meir came and continued to learn from him. And there's a story in the Talmud that Elisha was riding on a horse, publicly desecrating Shabbos, and Rebbe Meir was walking by him, next to him, and he was learning Torah from him. They're having a Torah discussion, and they came to the Shabbos Tchum, the boundaries of how far you're allowed to walk on Shabbos in a public domain, like walking out of the city. And Rebbe Elisha stopped Rebbe Meir and said, "You can't go further because you're keeping Shabbos, and this is the Tchum. This is the border." And that's from the guy they call Acher. So what is the Rebbe's point? The Rebbe's point says, let's go look at what each one talked about in the Mishnah and now understand it on a deeper level. It was Elisha ben Avuya who taught that he who studies Torah as a child, to what can he be compared? To ink written on fresh paper. Meaning that which he learned when he was younger was still solid. And he still had it. No matter how much was written over since he became Acher, he never lost that depth of Torah understanding to the degree that it was part of his consciousness to stop Rebbe Meir when they reached the Shabbos limits. Okay. And the respect he had for Rebbe Meir, to not let him transgress Shabbos inadvertently. That's fresh ink on fresh paper, right? What does Rebbe Meir teach? Let's go back to the Mishnah. Look not at the vessel, but what it contains. Don't judge Avuya from his current actions. See what's deeper within him when it was fresh ink on fresh paper. So here we are looking at someone that the Talmud itself calls Acher, and the Rebbe is looking deeper and saying, look at the gold that's within. Look at how precious is that within him. What a beautiful thing. So here's this one the Talmud has written off and called Acher, and he's the when someone wants to throw a negative at somebody else, they'll refer to Acher, making that reference back to Avuya, like a public disgrace. They call him Acher. But at the same time, the Rebbe goes back to the same person and learns the schus, learns the merit, but his Torah is still solid. And he wouldn't let Rebbe Meir transgress. That's the depth of what's in him. So these ideas, these Torah studies that we have are ways of things that we can learn from, but the idea is to be able to go deeper into them. And actually the saying says, like, people tend to judge others by their actions and judge ourselves by our intentions. The Rebbe flips that and says, hey, let's learn deeper about the good intentions, and don't pay so much attention to what a person actually does. We have to acknowledge that part of it, but look deeper. Look deeper what the good is that's within all of that, right?
Ron?
So one of the examples he shares again here is going all the way back to the beginning, right? When we think about Adam Harishon, Adam, the first man, we all think about the first transgression that mankind does. Adam was given one mitzvah. He was created Friday afternoon, and he was given one mitzvah: do not eat from the tree which is in the center of the garden, and within the hour he blows it. So typically when we think about the story of Adam, it's with this, oh, come on, an hour? I would like to think that I could manage myself for an hour at least, right? And yet Adam, the first person who's like created in God's hands, in God's image, and an hour he couldn't. But the Rebbe goes and he says, hang on a second. Let's look at the reality of the situation. The whole purpose of creation was for God to hide himself and create a situation where mankind would have free choice by not being able to see the spiritual, and that God is hidden within the physical world, and have the temptations of the physical world to contend with, and in that find God. It's not that Adam, within an hour, he failed. The question is, how did he last an hour? How did he even last an hour when the Nachash, the serpent, the evil, all they had to do was try and convince him this one thing, and that was the whole sole purpose. Against that kind of challenge, he lasted an hour? Whoa. That's amazing. So, again, the idea of being able to judge others favorably and to be able to look deeply within and see with so much of the world hidden, with all of godliness hidden, and the job is that we have to reveal God. The fact that Adam held out for now, that's an amazing, amazing thing. And what do we learn from that? We learn the more the resistance we encounter when it comes to doing something right, how much more important that right thing is. Right? When the battle gets the toughest, what do they say? It's when the going gets tough, the tough get going. Right? That's the old slogan. So it's precisely when the battle is the hardest, and we're going to judge that he failed. No, the fact that he lasted that long is already miraculous. And I love the next example he gives, because if there's anybody in the Torah stories that is villainized, it's Esav. It's like Jacob's alter ego. You got Jacob and Esau, or Yaakov and Esau, right? So from the very get-go, we understand that Yaakov is the good one and Esau is the bad one. And Yaakov is totally holy. Ohel Torah, he sits and he learns in Torah, intense. And Esau is a man of the field. He's a hunter. He's an aggressor. And so we know that's good and evil against itself, right? But the Rebbe says, hang on. It says that Isaac loved Esau. How could it be that our forefather Isaac, Yitzchak, favored Esau over Yaakov? We all know that his mother sees the difference between the two, and she's the one who helps Yaakov go and steal the blessings and all. But how is it that Yitzchak favors? It says clearly, Yitzchak loved Esau. So how is that? So in this struggle of our physical world of good and evil, Esau, which we've epitomized as the essence of evil, Yitzchak sees the potential. Yitzchak sees the potential of what he could be if he chose to do the right things, if he chose to follow the path of Torah. What he could accomplish would outshine Yaakov by far.
You really think that? Because Esau's firstborn, am I correct?
Yeah.
and
Well, remember, they're twins.
that's true, but he comes out first.
Esav comes out first, but Yaakov, yeah, so there's a whole comment,
So,
but they're twins.
But Jacob traded him for a bowl of lentil soup.
So let's look at that idea, right? We villainize Esav because he's all about the physical world, right? He's all about physical stuff and all the good stuff of life. Hold that story for just a second. Fast forward. We have King Saul, right? First king of Israel, right? And he blows it because he doesn't immediately kill the king of Amalek. And so therefore, when the prophet Samuel comes into the picture and he says, "What, you didn't follow God's instructions to kill Amalek? You let the king live, and you, for that you've lost the kingdom." And he goes, the prophet Shmuel, he goes to the house of Yishai, the house of Jesse, and he goes to the sons. He brings his sons, and he's told that the next king of Israel, you're to go anoint the next king of Israel, the house of Yishai. So he goes to this, and Yishai lines up his boys, and like each one of them is like more handsome than the next, and each one of them is an amazing figure of pride and phenomenal guys, right? And Shmuel Hanavi, he stands in front of each one of these young men, and he looks at him, and God says to the prophet, "Nope, that's not him." So next to the next one, "Nope, that's not him. Nope, that's not him." He goes down the line, goes to the last one, "No, that's not him." Now they were really impressive. So the prophet Shmuel, he then turns to Yishai, and he says, "You've got another son." And Yishai says, "Nah, the runt of the litter, he's out in the field. You don't want to see him. He's not the next king of Israel." He says, "Go fetch him." He brings David. Shmuel Hanavi stands in front of David, and he shudders with pachad, with a fear, a trembling. Because when he looks at David, he sees Esav. He sees Esav. And he's terrified. He can see the bloodshed. He can see the ravaging. He sees, but God says to the prophet, "But you don't know his heart." So yes, in many ways you see Esav, but you don't know his heart. And David becomes the next king of Israel. And yes, he's got bloody hands, but all of that is for the service of God. And he becomes the next king of Israel, to whom the dynasty remains forever. Mm-hmm. But when Shmuel saw him, he saw Esav. Esav had the capacity, the ability to take the physical world and the passion he had for the physical world and turn it into godliness and turn it into good. He chose not to do so. But he had the capacity, and Yitzchak saw the capacity that was there. He saw what he could be, and that's why he loved Esav, because he saw what Esav could do, and he saw the potential. We still have the same challenges we see later in the children of Yaakov. We see that Yehuda wants the Jewish people to stay insular and involved only in Torah mitzvahs and be secluded from the world. Joseph, on the other hand, has that idea of, no, our job is to go out in the world, pick up the physical world and make it holy, reveal the godliness within the physical world. So again, back to Yitzchak and Esav. Yitzchak saw the greatness of Joseph, the greatness of David HaMelech. He saw the potential for what Esav could be. And that's what he loved, because he could do so much more. Yaakov later on, in his contentions with his twin brother, Yaakov will come to realize that that which Esav is not doing now falls on Yaakov to be able to realize. The power of Esav, Yaakov has to complete. The power of Esav, Yaakov has to elevate. And he calls upon his sons to be able to pull all this off together, right? But again, if we only look at the historical facts of Esav, he's the villain, he's horrible, he's a terribly offensive. How could his father love him? Because look deeper. He has a capacity. We have to know that we've got to be able to use all of those energies, the energy of Yaakov and the energy of Esav, to be able to elevate the world. We need to be able to do that. And to do that, it means to be able to see the depth of the negativity and find the gold within it, find the beauty within it, and bring that out, even from those things which we would typically see as very, very negative. Now, we have an interesting story about the 12 spies. And again, we see a similar trait. That Moses tells the 12 spies at the end of their travels to Israel. They've left Egypt, and they haven't spent 40 years in the desert yet. The 40 years in the desert is because of what happens in the story, right? They come out of Egypt, they receive the Torah, they're going to head to Israel, and Moses agrees to send spies out to check out the land. Their job is go check out the land and find out which way we should conquer. They come back and say, we can't do it, we can't conquer it, forget it. And Moses reprimands them because that's not your job. Your job was not to make a decision of yes or no. Your job was to find out how we're going to go in, what path we'll take to go conquer. So they overstood their boundaries, right? And because of their evil report, we spent 40 years in the desert, and the entire generation of the desert died in the desert, and only our kids are the ones that would go in. So the 12 spies, 10 of them are the ones who spread the rumors, the bad stories, and they're the ones who are villainized in the Torah. And again, in the Talmud, we talk about, the tragedy of the whole thing, and the 40 years in the desert, and everyone dying in the desert. But the Rebbe let's look deeper. Who are these guys, these 10 guys? These are not 10 shlamazels that were, picked out from the, from the refuse of the different tribes. These were leaders. These were leaders of their tribes. These were, in fact, the Torah even talks about them as these were the guys who took the abuse and didn't pass it on. The Egyptian taskmasters would whip the Jewish, I forget the term there, but the Jewish leaders whose job it was to push the Jews to do more work. And when the Jews didn't provide the work, they're the ones who took the beating. They didn't pass it on. It's not like the boss who gets yelled at by his boss and turns around and screams at the worker, right? They took the abuse and they didn't pass it on. And in fact, later on, actually, I'm mixing up two stories. Sorry about that one. The spies came back to say we can't do it. What was their point? Their point was that to live in the land and be spiritual at the same time, that's too hard a task. Rather, we should stay in the spiritual world. In the desert, God provided the food, He provided the water. Our clothes grew on us like a turtle shell. Our clothes grew on us, and we lived a totally spiritual life. To ask us to go into a physical world and become farmers and also be spiritual, that's too much. They were protecting us from those responsibilities when they came back and said we can't do it.
That's not actually in the Torah. This is coming from Hasidut, right?
But remember, Hasidus is looking deeper into the stories of the Torah itself. So you're finding, what is their quote? Their quote is that the land swallows its inhabitants. What does that mean? How many of us have gotten lost in our work? Didn't get to minyan on time. Didn't get to put on tefillin that day because of. That's what it means. If you've got to be able to earn a living in order to provide for yourself food and shelter, then how are you also expected to be holy and spiritual? It's too much. That's what the spies were saying. It's too much, this expectation. And admittedly, we struggle with it, right? But God says we can do it. We have to strategize. We have to spy out the land and figure out how to do it. But that is the job, and that was their report, is we can't do it. The other story that I was mixing in here was the stories of Dosan and Aviram. Dosan and Aviram are always the troublemakers. From the time we first meet them in Egypt, all the way through till their death, they're always the troublemakers. And what we see is that they were leaders of the Jewish people, and their responsibility was to protect the people. So they took the abuse and didn't pass it on. At the same time, what was their point? The Rebbe is bringing out that Dosan and Aviram, they were vigilant guardians of the people. They were complaining to Moses when things got difficult, why are you making problems? So every time we see them as coming to cause trouble, they're coming from a place of trying to defend the people. And that's what we have to be aware of, and seeing that deeper within is the good side. There's a classic story here about the spiritual overdose, right? Again, Nadav and Avihu, these were the two Kohanim, the two sons of Aaron. The Torah tells us they offered a strange fire before God, which he had not commanded. A fire went out from God and consumed them, and they died before God. So in our commentaries,
the way that story.
Commentaries ask why were they killed? Why did God kill them? And there's a number of reasons that the Torah brings out, that the Talmud brings out. They entered the holy tabernacle without permission. They weren't wearing the Kohanim, the required garments of the Kohen when they did their service. They were never married and never had children, meaning they were neglecting the responsibility of building up the world because they would rather remain holy. Judaism is not one of those faiths that the greatest goal is to go live in a monastery up in the mountains and refrain from being a part of the world. No, I remember there was a story that Rabbi Manas Friedman years ago, he had been invited to a speaking engagement. He didn't realize that he was part of a panel, and on the panel were other faith leaders, and each of them was speaking about attaining the highest levels of spirituality. Mm-hmm. And they kept talking about asceticism and setting the world aside and fasting and all these other things. And when it got to Manas's turn, he was like, that's not a real challenge. To separate yourself from the world and become holy, that's not a challenge. The challenge is to get married, have kids, and have a job and try and still be holy. Now that is an accomplishment. Mm-hmm. That is an accomplishment, right? And so the same thing with Nadav and Avihu. The fact that they refused to get married, refused to have children, is because they wanted this spiritual life, but that's not our job. That's not what we're here for. So what it says here, that when they passed away, what was the pasuk says? And they died before God. They died before God, meaning that they attained that closeness. They attained that closeness to which their souls would take flight. So in a sense, they avoided the physical world and became totally spiritual. And the Torah shows all the negative sides of that. But why is the Torah, if the Torah is a teaching for us at all times, why are we telling us the story? One is to not get too spiritual, right? Stay grounded, right? That's part of it. But it's also telling us we should want that goal. We should want to have the opportunity to be completely spiritual, like we lived in the desert where God provided for us and all we had to do was study Torah and become holy. We should want that so badly and then turn around and live in the world because that's what God wants of us. What we should want is to become totally one with God in a spiritual connection. But we stay in the world and we have a job and we have a family in order to serve God because that's what God wants us to do. That balance between desiring the spiritual but staying in the physical because that's the Torah command creates a proper balance for us in life. So we want to take that lesson and think about it, but also learn from it what we need to do. But we definitely want to latch on to that holier side of Nadav and Avihu to cleave, to want to become holy. And one of the most fascinating stories is this story about Miriam Bas Bilga. Miriam Bas Bilga, the time of the Chashmonayim stories, this time of the Greek conquest and everything. The Talmud tells us about Miriam Bas Bilga, about how she abandoned Judaism, married a Greek officer, and accompanied the Greeks as they stormed the Holy Temple.
Yeah.
So her whole family, she was like a blemish on the whole family for generations to come. And the Talmud shares this story that she accompanied them as they stormed the temple. And when she got to the holy altar, she took off her shoe and she banged on the altar, crying out, "Wolf, wolf!" Wolf means is that aspect of God when He consumes the offering on the altar, right? So she's yelling God, calling God wolf. You consume the people's wealth, but you don't answer them in their time of need. So she's looked on as disgrace for all that she's done. But think about this, the Rebbe says. And the Rebbe really actually broke into tears when sharing this story. Here was a gal who's forgone everything about Judaism, and yet in our deepest hour, she's angry at God for not protecting us. She's emotionally distraught that God abandoned us, and she's yelling at God. This is the same gal who abandoned us? What do you mean she abandoned us? Look at her now. She's yelling at God for abandoning us. That means the depth within her is still 100% with us, even after all she's done. But again, you think about the topic of our story here is all about positivity bias, right? How to find the good in even the most villainous of people. And here you see that the Rebbe is able to look and find that godly spark even in a person whom the Talmud itself has villainized for decades. And I think we'll close with this last story. Which is the story of Moshe himself.
The golden calf story?
Pardon?
The golden calf, right?
Right. So the Torah tells us that when Moses was up on the mountain learning one-on-one with God, God says there's a disturbance in the camp, you better go check it out. And he goes down and he finds that in his short absence, they expected him down in 40 days, but they didn't count the days correctly. And within that 12-hour period that they believe he's late, they build a golden calf and start worshiping. And when Moses sees the situation, he breaks the tablets. Now, and it says he's angry and he breaks the tablets. So there's a lot of pieces to this story.
Mhm.
A lot of pieces to this story. But the bottom line of here is that you could see it as in the simplest fashion, the most common idea is that Moses lost his temper and he broke the tablets. The Talmud, the Medrash goes into great detail about the situation here, but the bottom line is that if he delivered the tablets,
Mhm.
that would be the end of the Jewish people. Because the tablets was the kesubah, the marriage
Ketubah.
document. If the Jewish people committed adultery,
Mhm.
chose after another god, after they're already engaged,
Mhm.
that's considered adultery and it carries a death penalty.
Right.
Moses destroys the document before he delivers it to the Jewish people,
Mhm.
and now they're not engaged,
Yeah.
and it's not adultery, and there's no death sentence.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's what I've heard. Right. Yeah. It's
Moses has the audacity to take the tablets given by God and destroy them in order to save the Jewish people. It's not the first time we've seen him do something crazy like argue with God and say, forgive them or erase me from your book, right?
Yeah.
Well, but bottom line is, when given the choice of God or the Jewish people, Moses sticks with the Jewish people.
Yeah.
And by the end of the Torah, with the Talmud shows within the Torah itself that God basically says, good going. Yashakachacha. More power to you for breaking the tablets.
Yeah.
Because when we asked, there's an old Yiddish saying of which is better, love of God or love of Israel? Love of the Jewish people or love of God? Which is better?
Mhm.
The answer is love of Jews, because we love whom our beloved loves. God loves the Jewish people. We love the Jewish people. By loving the Jewish people, we're also loving God. So that covers both. We love who our beloved loves.
Mhm.
And so when Moses chooses the Jewish people over even God, so he's showing that he values God's people even more, and that God loves, that God truly loves. I have had the blessing the past couple of decades to watch my kids as they're growing up and raising their own kids. And one of the greatest nachas, treasures I have, is watching my kids look after each other.
Mhm.
When they make the time to take care of each other, when they take the time to go visit each other, when they go out of their way to stick together, there's no greater nachas. And when God looks down on the Jewish people and he sees the Jewish people looking after each other, that's the kind of nachas he gets. So which is greater, love of God or love of the people? Love of Jews is even greater than love of God. Because we love whom our beloved loves. And I think that's the beautiful thing here, is that we're learning this positivity bias is within every Jew, there's a godly soul, there's a beautiful, untainted spiritual spark. Sometimes we have to dig deeper than others. But if we look, if we dig, we will find it. Not only in those who are currently alive, but even those who are villainized in the Torah itself. If we look deep enough, we'll see that within them is a great godly holy spark that wants to bring out good and holy things, and we just have to look for it. Sometimes harder than others, but even like, for example, Esav. Yitzchak loved Esav. It's there in the Torah. What was the love about Esav? We only hear the negative, right? Our Father sees also the positive. Looks deeper and deeper to see what really the great blessings that are truly there. So I always like to ask at the end of a class, I always like to say, with personal experiences, right?
Mhm.
So this was a story on going back into history and finding the good about those who seem to have been villainized over the years.
Mhm.
So, any examples? I'll start with one that I thought of. A name came up earlier before class started, right? For those who are in my age range, I'll give it a range, right? Typically, we think of Nixon
Mhm.
as a tremendous failure of presidency and leaving in shame and sad and debacle.
Mhm.
And that's 100% true.
I
But
think
on
that I'm sorry, I disagree. I've been quiet all evening. You expect this, don't you?
what do you say? I didn't say anything yet.
Yeah.
Yes, you did. You
Hey,
said
you didn't
see
finish.
Nixon as a failure as president.
So what I wanted to bring out is those who see that as a complete failure of presidency, if you look at some of the things he achieved in international arena
Right.
were things that
Exactly.
others could not have achieved.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, they were saying only Nixon could go to China.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Right.
And pull that
Yes.
off.
Right. So I'm using that as an example of his exit from presidency was a disgrace. But don't stop there.
Yeah.
Look back and see what else was actually accomplished. So I'm asking you examples. Who are people that you think of as villainized in history, but if you look deeper, you'll find something good? And we're extending this Torah concept to the nations of the world. Obviously, we've been talking about the godly soul, the Jewish soul, and seeing deeper within every Jew, right? But every human being is created in the image of God. Where have you seen, when you dig deeper, you find something that's also good? Bob, you've got that smile on. Go ahead.
There are so many examples of people who accomplish things can be villainized and still be lionized at the same time. Recently, you've got what a dozen Oscar nominations for the movie Oppenheimer.
Yeah.
Here's a man. Was he a villain, or did he do great good for mankind? He did both.
Yes.
It
Mhm.
depends on which one you want to home in on, I suspect.
Well, see, what he did, which is so often the case in human development and in human achievements. You design a wonderful tool that can be good, can be used for great benefit to mankind, but there will always be ways when people turn it around and create an instrument of evil.
Exactly.
Depends on how you use it.
So that goes back to Nobel Prizes, right? How did the
Mhm.
Nobel Prizes come to be?
Yeah.
Because
Boom.
Nobel himself saw an obituary.
Yeah.
He hadn't
Then-
died yet, but there was an obituary talking about
By
the man
himself.
who created gunpowder,
Dynamite.
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 Gunpowder, the
Right.
Chinese did that.
Chinese, right?
Yeah,
So,
right.
so therefore, when he saw his obituary villainizing him,
Mhm.
he felt a need to change that up, right? So now people don't know about the villain part; they only know about they don't know about the dynamite. They know about the Nobel Peace
Yeah.
Prize, right?
Yeah, right. Nobody talks about dynamite. Nobel Peace Prize, right? Right. Mhm.
Well, in
Okay.
American history, you've got all kinds of people that we look at now, and we see the greatness of the people, like the Vanderbilts, for instance. A good example to me. They've done wonderful things, particularly since their death. But while they were alive, amassing their fortune, they were anything but good people. It depends, I suppose, on your perspective and your bias.
That's it. It's the bias, right? Are we biased at finding the good,
Mhm.
at seeing the good?
I suppose it depends on whether you're looking at it through contemporary eyes or hindsight.
Even our own Jewish history, we have stories like this. King David,
Exactly.
oh, he was, the whole thing with
Yeah, Bathsheba.
piece
of work.
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
that was just
Bathsheba.
wrong, but I mean, he did go on to accomplish great things.
So it's fascinating because when you look at Tanakh, Navi,
Yeah.
and then you look at the Talmud, they can take the same personality and take a completely different bent on them. Look at them completely differently. David is an example of, and Shaul, King Shaul also. You
Yeah.
know, Navi will trash him, but the Talmud will talk about his greatness.
Mm.
You know,
Both
you
true.
talked about David getting blood on his hands in the service of God. I think that's the way you described it
Yep.
earlier. And now I may be remembering incorrectly, but it seems to me that David has blood on his hands through all kinds of service and a search for service and women and sex, none of which I don't think was to go forth and multiply.
He's just having fun.
So what you're doing is you're describing the good characteristics of David. But
Right. So in the
but in
Talmud,
that observation, you're omitting the evil.
so when we look at again, as I said, in the Talmud and in the book of Navi, oftentimes they're portrayed differently. In Navi, King Saul is vilified and loses the kingdom. King David is a shining example. But the Talmud does the opposite. The Talmud talks about the greatness of the first king and all the problems with David. And so, different parts of the Torah are focusing on different light. But the end of the story is that King David began a dynasty, and the Torah tells us that the kingdom belongs to David, and only kings from his dynasty can rule.
I think in general, we tend to see the negative in people long before we see the positive. And we just look at our newspapers where the predominant stories are all negative.
I prefer not to look at the newspapers or the media
Amen.
for that reason, for that very reason.
I think the whole point of this chapter is that the Lubavitcher rabbi, he saw the good and kind of shrugged off the bad.
Chose to focus on the light, chose to focus on the good. A conscientious decision. If we remember earlier in the chapters, this is someone who had suffered the pogroms in Russia and lost his father to the Tsar hatred and anti-Semitism. He lived through Warsaw Ghetto. He lived through the death through World War II, losing most of his family in World War II. Coming to America, made a conscientious decision, focus on the good. Focus on the good, shine a light on the good, focus on the positive, and that is what's going to change the world to good things, not complaining about the negative and bearing tales about other people, but rather to focus on the positive at all times. That is then the goal.